Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary on a serial killer. Now, for a while, I've said I wasn't really going to be doing shows or programs like World's Most Evil Serial Killers, Born to Kill, Most Evil, stuff like that, because I feel like it's just each episode is kind of like a different look at a serial killer. I wanted to do more standalone kind of documentaries on killers. This is kind of cheating because this is a show. I think there was 11 episodes. I could be wrong. I think there was 11 episodes, ran from 2019 to 2021. And aside from this, I will also be doing the A&E biography documentaries on serial killers as well, just because those and this program feels more like standalone documentaries than, say, programs where just each episode is kind of a different killer. So maybe I'll do like as a whole on Born to Kill or World's Most Evil Serial Killers, but I won't be doing individual episodes, though I will for this program, because each episode is about an hour, 25 minutes, so it feels like a feature-length documentary. You have different people involved with it, whereas like Born to Kill, World's Most Evil, kind of has the same psychiatrists, true crime writers, maybe people involved in the cases, whereas here, from what I've gathered, it's all people very specific to each case, and each episode just feels more like a standalone documentary. So this is going to be the first one of that, and the show is Mind of a Monster. I think there's 11 episodes. I've seen the Ed Kemper one, or more so I listened to the Ed Kemper one. I think I listened to it while I was driving. So this is the first one I've actually watched. So yeah, this would be the first Mind of a Monster review. It's not going to be a consistent marathon, but from time to time, Mind of a Monster will come up. And so yeah, this is the 5th episode. It's actually, as far as serial killer cases go, it's a top 5 for me. It's one of my top 5 favorite cases. And I don't think I've really seen too many documentaries on this guy, save for your typical Born to Kill, World's Most Evil, Portraits of Evil, Beyond Evil. I think I've seen the A&E one, stuff like that I've seen on this guy. But it's episode 5, and that is Butcher Baker, or The Butcher Baker, which is about the Alaska's most notorious serial killer, Robert Hansen. And I've always found this guy to be very, very fascinating. He has a very different MO, a very different sort of environment. You don't really hear about a lot of serial killers from Alaska. You don't really hear a lot of people with this kind of, MO, or kind of how they killed their victims, which is, he was known to pick up prostitutes from the red light district, bring them to his home when his family was out, which that's another aspect of Robert Hansen I've always found fascinating. I find the ones with families and very structured lives, like BTK, like John Wayne Gacy, like Green River Killer, to be some of the most fascinating. He'd bring them to his house, where he would, torture and assault them there, and then take them by plane to the vast, remote wilderness along the Knik River, kind of give them a head start, and then he would track them down and hunt them like wild game. He was a very skilled hunter, very skilled marksman, very avid outdoorsman, so he really knew how to track his prey, and that was his MO. They were able to link him to, I think, 17 murders, even though they think he might have been responsible for 21, 22, but he ultimately confessed to 17. The only books I have on him, sadly, is this small book by Jack Smith and Butcher Baker by Walter Gilmore and Leland A. Hale, which Hale is actually one of the talking head interviewees in this episode. Now, overall, I will say it has a very similar structure to a lot of your true crime programs, like the aforementioned shows or even A&E biography, where it kind of opens up, it sets the environment, it sets the whole setting, in this case, Alaska. And it talks about like some of the last few victims how they've been connected to previous victims, and how eventually how these last few victims are able to put them on the trail of the actual serial killer. How they became known to the police starting to track them down. Then we cut backwards, get a little bit of their life, kind of play catch up, and then go back to the investigation, the arrest, and the aftermath. That's kind of how a lot of your true crime sort of documentary episodes are. This one is no different. But one thing I really, really liked about it, and one thing that helped me really think of like the Netflix Conversations with the Killer series, is you get a lot of audio from Hansen himself, which I haven't heard much audio from him at all. And in fact, there's a lot of video as well. Video of him, I think, around his arrest. Some video of like him at his bakery. So that's all a huge plus. And it kind of made me think like Netflix really needs to do, somehow Joe Berlinger needs to get a hold of the Hansen tapes and make a Conversations with the Killer episode of Hansen, because there was a lot in this episode. Also, one thing I really like about Mind of a Monster over some of the programs that I've said is all the talking heads are really people involved with the case, either family members of the victims, friends or acquaintances of the killer himself, people in law enforcement, people of the legal team, the defense or the prosecution, maybe a true crime writer, in this case Hale. You don't really just have sort of true crime documentary psychiatrists or people like that are in every episode that haven't really worked with the killer personally. So I really appreciate that. That helps make it a lot more interesting. And I will say, while this was in-depth with Hansen's life, it does go into a number of the victims. You do get a lot of audio from Hansen. I did notice it did leave a lot of stuff out. For example, there's a whole thing, because he's from Alaska, but his hometown is Pocahontas, Iowa. That's actually where he's from. And there was a thing where, I think it was in his early 20s, he burnt down a bus barn out of rage towards the school. It didn't mention that he had an underage accomplice help him with that arson, or one of his first victims who convinced him to let her go. It doesn't mention that he took her ID and threatened her family. It doesn't go into how, when police were on his tail, they actually interviewed some of his friends. It doesn't go into how the friends were asked by Hansen himself to lie for him and give him an alibi. So there is a lot of key information that is left out. A lot of it is centered around Sidney Paulson, his last would-be victim, the one that actually did get away. It doesn't really go into her relationship with State Trooper Flothy, or really how Flothy was kind of the head of the investigation. He's mentioned, but I don't think it sheds light on how major he was in the investigation, sort of his relationship with Paulson. So it is in-depth in some ways, but there is a lot of key information that it leaves out. So I wouldn't really say that this is the most essential Robert Hansen doc. In fact, I think even Born to Kill, or World's Most Evil Serial Killers, does mention that stuff. But nonetheless, I did find it very interesting, especially because of all the talking heads being involved in the case. Some of them, like this one officer turned detective at the midst of this case, Maxine Farrell, she's actually on some of the locations, like when they're talking about the search warrant of his house. She's actually at his house being interviewed. There's one woman who is a friend of one of the victims. She's on location at the parking lot where she, dropped her off or left her to go meet with Hansen. So it was filmed in and around Anchorage, Alaska. We get to see a lot of the actual locations as they were in present day, which really helps with the setting and the environment. But the thing that helps the most is the Hansen audio. That really made it as interesting as possible, which again, I really wish Netflix would do that. Because ultimately that is what it felt like. It felt like a lesser version of Netflix's Conversations with the Killer. Still well made. And since I've seen so many true crime documentaries, I was very used to the format where, some killings have been going on. These are some of the last few victims. Ultimately, this last one that got away, she's pointing us in the direction of this guy, Robert Hansen. But now we're going to go into his past, kind of work up, and now we're going to cut back to how he was investigated, how he was arrested, and ultimately what happened to him. So, kind of typical, that is how a lot of these documentaries are presented. But I still found it very interesting. Again, the fact that all the talking heads were people that involved with the case, all the audio from Hansen himself, being on location of a lot of the places in the case. It definitely made it a very interesting, in-depth watch, but it wasn't as in-depth or informative as it could have been. And I would even argue a lot of the information it left out is pretty key, especially the fact of, his friends getting his friends to provide an alibi for him. That was actually how he was able to get away for not long, but some time. So, it's still definitely worth checking out. If you're a fan of Conversations with the Killer on Netflix, there's definitely a lot to get from this. But it's not as in-depth, but it's still very interesting. Audio from Hansen is great. I would actually say it has more audio from Hansen than any of the Conversations ones do, so that helps. But yeah, I'll definitely be checking out more episodes of Mind of a Monster. I don't know if all of them are going to have that kind of information left out, but also, yeah, this is one of my top 5 favorite cases, so of course I found it very interesting. I watched this on Tubi, so you can find it there, and I really enjoyed it. So we'll get to the summary, and then sort of the, I apologize, long list of things that it covers, despite some of the key information it doesn't have. But so yeah, now we'll get into that. Robert Hansen was born February 15th, 1939. It was Alaska's most notorious and most prolific serial killer. It was dubbed the Butcher Baker after his capture. Though he has killed at least 17 women and possibly up to 21 between 1971 and June of 1983, he was only convicted of 4 murders, with the bulk of them being between 1980 and 83. It is also said that he raped at least 31 additional women. He was known as being a well-respected member of the community in or around Anchorage, Alaska. He owned a bakery. He was a devout churchgoer with his family, his wife, and 2 children. He was also a skilled master hunter, receiving many awards for marksmanship and hunting, and having many taxidermy trophies. This ties into Hansen's MO, as he would abduct young women, mostly prostitutes, sometimes under the pretense of paying for a photo shoot. First, he would take them to his home while his family was away, hold them captive, rape and torture them, then take them by plane, his own personal plane, to the vast wilderness of Alaska, strip them down, and give them a head start, which he would then track, hunt, and kill them like wild game. Then he would dress them up, supposedly to look like a lost hunter, and take a piece of jewelry as a trophy. On June 13th of 83, his would-be final victim, 17-year-old prostitute Cindy Paulson, was able to escape as he attempted to get her in his plane. She was able to describe his plane, and an airfield security guard got his car plate and plane numbers. And despite having two friends give an untrue alibi, one did come forth after hearing what he was questioned for. After a search warrant found many firearms, including the ones matching the casings found at the scenes, jewelry trophies, and an aviation map with X's on them, Hansen was arrested. After a plea for his confession, he was convicted of 4 of the 17 confirmed murders, sentenced to 461 years in 1984, and on April 21st, 2014, he died at the age of 75. So now we'll go into what the documentary actually covers. It opens up with a bunch of footage, photos, and audio. Most of the audio I've never heard before. But it does make me think that Netflix's Conversations with the Killer should do a Hansen tapes, because there's actually quite a bit of Hansen audio in this, and I think it's all from the same source. I think it's from some sort of confessional tape. So I would love to see Netflix Conversation with the Killer, the Hansen tapes. I think that would be awesome. This kind of feels like that, though, because after many of the segments, we get Hansen on whatever they just covered, and I did note that in here. So then it opens up, Nick River, 40 miles north of Anchorage, shots of the land, put to audio of Hansen talking about his hunting history there. We're introduced to a guy named Marshall Ellison, who is a friend. He talks about meeting Bob through church in 78, and through Bob, his wife Darla, going hunting and flying with Bob. Shows photos of Bob and Darla. We get audio of Hansen talking about his plane and flying. Goes into how Bob doesn't enjoy hunting for the outdoors or the game, but for the kill itself. So we go to September 12th, 1982. We're introduced to John Daly, who was part of the Anchorage PD. Talks about how he joined the force in 1980. He talks about how on that specific date, he went hunting with a friend along the Nick River. At first they found some denim clothing. And then underneath there was a body. Shows footage and photos of that search and the recovery. How bandages were found wrapped around the female body's head. Then we get bit from the Hansen tape, that's what I'll call it, is the Hansen tape, on why her head was wrapped. So she could not see where she was going, how it made him feel powerful and in control. Then we get more on Daly, from Daly, and footage of that search, how they found a shell casing of a .223 caliber. We get the photo of that. Hansen tape, how she ran away, but he caught her again. She just screamed, and then he shot her in the chest. So then we're introduced to Susan, and I don't remember if it's just her or a few, but they're just given to us by first name. So Susan, former dancer, she talks about being 18 when she first moved to Anchorage, talking about a fellow dancer friend named Sherry. Then we're introduced to Leland Hale, who is the co-author of Butcher Baker. Very good book. He talks about Anchorage during the oil boom, the red light district, and the lifestyle of people there and who go there. Hansen tape, rushing downtown after work to watch the prostitutes. Susan on trying to get out of that life, and then it goes into how serial killers prey on the vulnerable. Hansen tape, meeting them at bars and clubs, offering them money, but it has to go his way. Susan on how she met a man at a bar and had bad vibes from him. Said he had a plane. She wasn't into extracurricular activities. The next day, her friend Sherry had a date with the same guy. She walked her to her appointment, and she was never seen again. And this last part actually shows Susan on location at the parking lot where she took Sherry to go meet this guy with the plane. Then we go to October of 82. The body from September has been ID'd as Sherry Morrow, who is 24. Shows a photo of her. Name and age also shown. Susan talks about her death and the guilt that she felt and still feels. Photo of the body as she was found. Then we're introduced to Maxine Farrell, who is part of the Anchorage PD, on seeing a pattern of a serial killer, but no one believed her. It shows an older photo of her when she first joined the PD. Uh, One of the first few females to join the Anchorage PD. And then she goes into the hostile environment that it was for her at that time. Her involvement with the Hansen case after finding Eklutna Annie, which is still an unsolved case. July 17th, 1980, in Eklutna, 28 miles north of Anchorage. Farrell, on responding to a call where a body was found, it shows photos of the crime scene, her jewelry, and knowing that she was a prostitute. Hansen tape, picking her up, how she got away, but he caught up to her, but she had a big buck knife. Farrell, on the cause of death being a knife wound, shows photos of the found skull and the reconstruction that they did of what she would have looked like. How Farrell passed photos around, but it led nowhere. It shows Eklutna Annie on the timeline. Then we're introduced to Roxanne Eastland. Oh no, excuse me. Then it goes into Roxanne Eastland, who was 24. She was another prostitute whose case Farrell came across, and along with 2 to 3 a month. And then her starting to put them together, the Hansen tape, how he was getting bolder with no issues, couldn't wait to do it again. Hale on the mindset of police being like maybe they got jobs somewhere else and they moved away, because that was not uncommon. But Farrell believing a serial killer was on the loose. Farrell on making her spreadsheet with photos of the spreadsheet, how she looked into jewelry as possible trophies. And at first, when she first made her spreadsheet, she had 10 girls that were either found dead or still missing. It shows a photo of that spreadsheet. Photo of her from 1982 when she first made detective, though they still did not believe her that there was a possible serial killer out there. So then we're introduced to Wayne Goggins, who is a pastor, on coming to Anchorage in 1971 and how cold it was, how he met Hansen and his family shortly after, his initial impression of him, which was quiet, friendly, talked about his bakery, with footage of Hansen at his bakery, how he didn't attend church services regularly, but his wife did, and how his wife was one of the best teachers in Anchorage, especially with kids with disabilities like dyslexia, which then we're introduced to Diana Lynn Hansen, who was Hansen's daughter's school friend. She talks about Darla being one of, if not the best school teacher in Anchorage. Then we get some text on the screen saying Darla and Robert have 2 children named Christy and Johnny, which Diane shows them in a yearbook that she has, but Christy's face is blurred out. I'm guessing after everything with the arrest and the trial, she wanted to maintain anonymity, which it doesn't say anything about that. But she does say how good of a dad Robert was to Christy and Johnny. So then April 24th of 83, Hansen tape bringing her by plane to a remote area along the Nick River, landing, bringing her to a meat shack, and he says, here's where we'll spend the day. Then how a plane flew by, so he cuffed her to a pole in the meat shack. He watched the plane go by, hoping it wouldn't land, and it left, saying it scared him. But then he says how he shouldn't have called it a meat shack to her, because that's what got her mind going, and then it went bad. Which I assumed he was talking about Paula Goulding, who who was reported missing on April 25th of 83. So we go to September 28th of 83. Daily on how 2 hunters came across a body shot through the chest, 223 caliber casing found. We get photos of the scene, the body, and the casing. News footage of the scene with news voiceover about fears of a serial killer. Now, Paula Goulding was found on the 2nd of September, and I've never read anything about another body found on the 28th, and she was the only one found in September of 83, so I'm not sure which date is incorrect. We're not introduced to, but at least in the documentary, but people start talking about Sergeant Glenn Flothi, whom I believe Nicolas Cage was based on in the film Frozen Ground, which he now becomes involved, shows photos of him. Farrell on Flothi approaching her to form a task force, but how she wasn't allowed to work with him because of her superiors. She was Anchorage PD, he was a state trooper. They wouldn't let her pretty much join forces with higher jurisdiction. So she wasn't allowed to work with him. More news footage on the 12 missing women and their victim profile. And then Farrell talks about giving her all her files to Flothi for him to use. Then we're introduced to Karen O'Leary on how she met Bob Hansen through the Sunday Singles dating ad. She reads the original ad that he answered. Then the Hansen tape convinced his family to spend the whole summer in Europe and wanting to start a relationship or a close friendship with someone. June 8th of 83, O'Leary on her first date with Hansen. They went to a bar. He was nice, though he had a stutter, which I can relate to. She felt sympathy for him when he spoke about his bullied childhood. It was too windy for a plane ride, so they went back home to his house. Hansen tape, her being over, going down in the basement. They started to get intimate, which then she talks about going down into the basement, which was his trophy room, which is where he had all of his taxidermied game hung up. Because again, he was a very prolific, very skilled and accomplished hunter. Let's see, where was I? And his pride in that, and refusing his advances of making love on the bearskin rug, and then him getting very quiet. Hansen tape saying, when she said no, he didn't force her. She was nice, and that was okay. And then goes back to her talking about how lucky she feels. June 13th of 83, we're introduced to Greg Baker, who was of Anchorage PD. How he got involved in the case in 83. Wayne Vance, Anchorage PD, being trained by Baker. We're also introduced to him. Both on getting the call about a naked woman found in handcuffs at the Woods Motel. A guy in a truck spotted her running down 5th Avenue, picked her up and dropped her off at the motel. She said her name was Cindy Paulson, who was 17, shows a photo of her. Get audio of her saying he pulled up, offered $200 for oral sex. She accepted. Goes into her abduction, and then the Hansen tape, telling her to do exactly as he said. Her audio on being taken to an old house on Old Harbor Road in Muldoon. Goes into how she was brought downstairs to his man cave. Hansen tape, how he enjoyed sex on the bearskin rug, how he laid her on it and raped her. Her audio on being restrained by a chain around her neck and handcuffs and trying to think about her escape. Goes into how he took her to his plane to take her to his cabin. The Hansen tape telling her the truth about going to spend the weekend together. And it might sound confusing here, but it's basically the audio tapes going back and forth between his account and her account. So I try to label it properly, so let's see how that goes. Uh, her audio say being taken to the plane to go to the cabin, but being told that she'll be brought back, but she knew better, and how when she got to his plane, she cuffed him barefoot, ran, he chased her, but got away when a truck picked her up. Okay, I thought it was going to be more confusing than that. Greg Baker on how she picked out his plane and they were able to trace it back to Robert Hansen. Uh, Baker on his first meeting of Hansen, he thought he was an ordinary guy, cooperative. He went down to the station, but he could tell that he was lying. The initial search of his home shows photos of his trophy room. The Hansen tape, them finding a pistol that he hid, and how that scared him. Excuse me. But other than that, there was really no evidence that they could use against him. One other investigator believed his story. Prostitutes were not believed, but a businessman, family man were almost always believed, and the case was essentially dropped or set aside. July of '83, Baker on 3 weeks of nothing. He saw the investigation was suspended, so he looked into Hansen's background himself, which then we jump backwards to November 22nd of '71. A guy named Ron Rice, Anchorage PD, how we first met Hansen during his first arrest in Alaska for attempted abduction. The Hansen tape, he goes into this abduction. He calls her Miss Hepburn, which he's talking about Susan Hepburn. She wasn't a prostitute, but worked in real estate, how he wanted to talk to her, how her roommates saw what was going on, and he ran. Because he went to her apartment wanting to talk to her, but her roommate saw him, so he fled. He was arrested 30 minutes later. Shows his 1983 mugshot. I tried to find an older mugshot, and I don't think there are any. In fact, I don't think this book has any photos whatsoever. No, it doesn't. The Hansen tape, no intention of harming her, but one thing led to another. Rice on starting a new book of colored photos of possible sex offenders. Hansen being the first one in that book. Then we get text on screen. 32-year-old Robert Hansen was released on bail while awaiting a court date. Then we go to December 19th of '71. Goes into Patricia Roberts, shows a photo of her with eyes black-barred, as was Susan Hepburn when they talked about the '71 arrest. She was abducted at gunpoint and taken to the Kenai Peninsula, 160 miles away. He raped her. The Hansen tape, not knowing what to do with her once he had her, being even more scared than she was. She convinced him to bring her back, and she picked his new photo, the new photo that was in the book. She picked that photo out when she finally went to police. Picked him out as the man that abducted her, which it doesn't go into how when she convinced him to let her go, he took her ID, and he didn't threaten her with her address, but he threatened her family, her parents. So it was actually a few weeks or months before she went to the police out of fear that he would go after her family. So it doesn't really go into that. Photo of his 1971 arrest, or this arrest, which is the one where, he kind of has his head down, cuffed behind him, they're kind of dragging him by the jacket. Goes into the plea deal, plead guilty to assault with a deadly weapon on the Hepburn charge, and the Roberts case gets dropped. And then on screen it says, on March 4th, '72, Hansen is sentenced to 5 years for that charge. Charges in the Patricia Roberts case dropped in return. So we're introduced to Frank Rothschild, who was the assistant DA. Hansen learning to choose his victims. He can't choose nice girls, not ones who will be believed by police. Hansen tape, putting prostitutes lower than him, can do things with them that he can't do with good women. So then we cut back to Pocahontas, Iowa, 1951, to Rosemary Shaw Sackett, who was a classmate. She talks about Pocahontas being a small town, population of 2,000. Shows the class photo, then the school photo of Hansen. She goes into him as a kid, or as a student, quiet, bad grades. Parents ran a successful bakery. His stutter. The Hansen tape, having bad acne and speech, looked and sounded like a freak. Girls were not interested in him. After high school, he went into the Army. It shows his military photo. His first sexual experience was with a prostitute in New York City. Hansen tape. Being disappointed, and if you're going to pay for it, you should get to do what you want. It goes into the arson of the school bus barn. Hansen tape, how that was his revenge on school, and revenge on those he felt had it out for him. Although it doesn't mention that he had a teen accomplice, and the teen accomplice felt guilt for burning down the bus barn, and he was the one that turned Hansen in. So, didn't really mention that either. So then on the screen it says Robert Hansen is given a 3-year sentence for arson in 1961. It goes into the aftermath of his arrest, his parents moving, his divorce from his first wife. After serving 20 months, Hansen is released in 1963. Hansen tape, he talked about getting out, meeting Darla Hendrickson, getting married, and then moving to Alaska in 1967. So then we jump back forward to September 13th of 83. Greg Baker on liking Hansen as a suspect for Paulson and the other disappearances, turning the files over to the troopers for jurisdictional reasons and a larger search and investigations. Because, of course, they can only look at Anchorage. State troopers can look at the entire state. Hansen tape, being back on the hunt despite not wanting to, but being drawn to it, but being scared, knowing that they're onto him. Robin Burkhart. We're introduced to Robin Burkhart, who was Paula Goulding's roommate. She talks about Paula as a person, how they became roommates, how Paula wasn't fond of being a dancer, how the one time she got fully nude is the time that Hansen happened to be there. April 24th of 83. It does a back and forth between Burkhart saying that Goulding was a beautiful woman with her whole life ahead of her, and the Hansen tape on how he killed her. It continues from earlier when he said, I shouldn't have called it a meat shack, because that's what got her mind going. And how she managed to get away and run, and he shot her. Shows her on the timeline. Burkhart on being informed in September of 83 about her body being found. Rothschild on the troopers wanting a search warrant of Hansen's home, and the plan was to get him out of the house for questioning, and then we conduct the search simultaneously. So October 27th of 83, Baker talks about Hansen being brought in. He talks about the layout of the room with all the photos and files everywhere. It goes into the interrogation with audio. The search that was happening simultaneously. Photos of and inside the house. Maxine Farrell, who she's actually on location at Robert Hansen's house, talks about how she was brought in for the search so that she could ID the jewelry. And how when she went in, Hansen's kids were terrified. It shows a photo of them playing on the floor. I don't know if it was from that search or just a random photo. Hansen tape asked why he When asked why he goes around for hookers with a wife at home, he says because he wanted oral sex and would never want his wife to perform such an act. We're introduced to Pat Kasdick, who an Alaskan state trooper. The uh, difficulty of finding key evidence at the Hansen house until they went into the attic. More interrogation audio trying to get him to break. Flothi being concerned that he wouldn't break, so he leaves and gets involved in the search. How his cache of rifles, he had a big rifle collection. A lot of them were out to be found, but the ones that could link him to the murders he had hid. He had stuffed between two studs in the wall, buried in insulation, including the 223 that they needed, which links him to 2 murders right then. Shows a photo of where and how they were found, and then a plastic bag of jewelry being found behind more insulation elsewhere. And then photos of the pieces of jewelry that were found. News footage of him as the killer. No airtight case, but then goes into the aviation map that was found and how each mark could be a dump site. It doesn't say that it was found behind his headboard, but I believe that that's where it was found. February 19th of 84, 4 months since his arrest. Wayne Goggins going in to visit him, and how Hansen asked him, what sins does God forgive? And he told him all but blasphemy. And then Hansen just thanked him and then signaled to leave. He confessed 2 days later. February 22nd of 84, Rothschild on having to keep your cool no matter what during a confession. Back and forth between him and the tape of the confession, which Rothschild was involved in. Originally only confessing to the murders that they had on him until they brought out the flight map, asked about the X's, and how he had a story for each X that they pointed to, ultimately confessing to 17 of the 21 marks that was on the map. On February 27th of 84, Robert Hansen is sentenced at the state courthouse in Anchorage. Baker on the trial, audio of the trial, Rothschild reading his statement, which I believe it was his closing statement, and then text on screen. For the murders of Sherry Morrow, Paula Goulding, including Annie and Joanna Messina, plus the kidnapping and rape of Cindy Paulson, Robert Hansen is sentenced to 461 years plus life. Then Baker goes into a story on how Cindy came up to him after the trial, hugged him and thanked him, and how she looked like a whole new woman. She was no longer in prostitution. Though I believe she went back, I think she went back and forth a few times after that, then eventually got out of it for good and got married. Then the last thing it says is, using Hansen's map, 7 more bodies are recovered by the Alaska State Troopers throughout April and May of 1984, which it doesn't mention how including Annie is still unidentified, but another unidentified one for almost 40 years, Horseshoe Harriet, was finally ID'd as 19-year-old prostitute Robin Pelkey in 2021. And then it shows one last time in the Farrell's spreadsheet as the credits roll. So I think this is actually the first episode of Mind of a Monster that I've seen. I think there's 9 episodes. I could be wrong. I think it's between 9 or 12 episodes. It kind of has the same feel as many other serial killer documentaries I've seen, like A&E or World's Most Evil, Serial Killers, Born to Kill, where it kind of starts with the more recent kills, how they're kind of get on the trail of the killer, cut back to his earlier life, work up, and then jump back to where we were in the beginning. It does leave out a lot of stuff. You know, it leaves out a lot of his previous marriage. It does leave out key things like the one prostitute who convinced him to let her go, but he kept her ID, threatened her family, or how he had a teenage accomplice help him burn down the bus barn. Sort of the relationship between Flothi and Paulson. Paulson even staying either with him or in a safe house that he knew about. So it does leave out a lot. It doesn't feel like a bare bones, straightforward kind of a bullet point documentary either, like a lot of Dahmer or Ted Bundy ones that I've seen. It's still very interesting. It's pretty much mostly just people that were involved in the story, save for Leland Hale, the co-writer of this book, which those are the documentaries that I prefer, the ones that are all people involved in the story. Has a lot of audio from Robert Hansen, which I really appreciated. Again, really makes me wish that Netflix would do Conversation with a Killer Hansen tapes. So yeah, I highly recommend it. I think I've seen the Kemper and the Gary Ridgway ones, but I think that was more listening while I was driving rather than actually watching. So I'll definitely be checking those out. So yeah, I won't be doing series like World's Most Evil Serial Killers or Born to Kill or anything like that. But I will be doing A&E Biography, and I will be doing Mind of a Monster. Those are the only actual programs that I'll be reviewing each episode. But yeah, this is one of my all-time favorite cases, and it didn't really go too in-depth with his MO, which was kind of the only major disappointing thing. It kind of mentioned that he would track them down and hunt them like wild game, but it didn't really go too in-depth with it. But still a very solid documentary, very interesting. Still has plenty worth checking out, especially the audio. So yeah, that is Mind of a Monster, Butcher Baker. I watched it on Tubi, so you can find it there. So I will be doing more Mind of a Monster episodes. There's a few other documentaries that I'm checking out as well. And there's still movies that I got to get back to that I've been meaning to watch for a while. So stay tuned for those, and thank you for watching.